morning, guys. All right, we are going to read a book about Frederick Douglass today. And so we're going to read about why he was important in American history. Frederick Douglass. Who was Frederick Douglass? Frederick Douglass was born a slave. He worked hard for his master for no money. His master told Douglass where to live, what to eat, and what to do. After 20 years as a slave, Douglass escaped. So he escaped just like Harriet Tubman. He began speaking out against slavery. He didn't stop until all slaves were freed. Then he worked to help freed slaves have better lives. Born a slave, Douglass was born in February 1818 on a farm in Talbot County, Maryland, USA. Soon after his birth, his mother was sent to work on another farm, so they took him away from his mother. Douglass only saw her 4 or 5 times. Douglass only saw her 4 or 5 times. She died when he was 7. He never knew his father. You can see this is a wood engraving of slaves working with the cotton line in the South. Douglass spent his early years with his grandparents. They lived in a cabin about 12 miles from his master's farm. Douglass's grandfather was a freeman, but his grandmother was a slave. She took care of slaves who were too young to work. As an adult, Douglass had this cabin built in his backyard in Washington, D.C. It looked like the one where he had lived with his grandparents. When Douglass was about 6 years old, his grandmother took him to their master's farm. She didn't want to leave him there, but she had to do what her owner said. Douglass knew that he was expected to obey the master too. About 2 years later, Douglass was sent to Baltimore, Maryland to work. He had heard stories about the city and was excited to go. In his time, in the 1820s, growing up as a slave was very difficult from growing up as a child who was free. School. Slaves did not attend school. Teaching a slave to read was against the law, so you were not even supposed to teach them to read. And education would give a slave power. Events. Some people helped slaves escape their masters. The group of people that led slaves to safety was called the Underground Railroad. Slaves who traveled without their owners had to carry a pass from their masters. Black people who had been freed had to carry papers saying they were not slaves. Rights. Slaves had no rights. Slaves were listed as property along with animals. They could be sold to other slave owners at any time and separated from their children. When their masters died, a few slaves were given their freedom, but most got new owners, so they were still not free. Sometimes slaves could buy their freedom, but since most slaves did not earn any money, that rarely happened. So it's very, very hard for them. Learning to read. In Baltimore, Douglass worked with Hugh Auld and his wife. He took care of their young son and ran errands. Mrs. Auld started teaching Douglass to read. Mr. Auld told her to stop. He said slaves should know only one thing, how to obey their master. So Mrs. Auld was trying to be kind to him and teach him, and then she was told not to. But Douglass kept learning. He gave biscuits to poor white children he met on the errands. In return, they helped him read. So he actually gave away things because he really wanted to read. It says that's a fact. With 50 cents Douglass earned from his polishing shoes, he bought a book of famous speeches and read it many times. When Douglass was 15, he was sent back to the farm. His master had died. He now had a new owner. Douglass had to work hard in the field. He was often treated badly. He tried to escape, but he was caught. Other slave owners were angry. Douglass had set a bad example for their slaves. To avoid trouble, Douglass's new master sent Douglass back to Baltimore to work for the Auld family again. Runaway slave. In Baltimore, Douglass met free black people. He fell in love with a free black woman named Anna Murray. More than ever, he wanted to be free. On September 3rd, 1838, he tried to escape again. He headed north by boat and train. If he were caught, he might be killed or sold. But he made it to New York, a free state, and he sent for Anna, and they got married. Over time, Douglass and Anna had 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. Douglass and Anna moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts, USA. There, Douglass met people who wanted to abolish slavery. Remember, abolish means to make it end and stop. In 1841, he spoke at one of those meetings. Douglass told the crowd about his life as a slave. The people liked his speech. Douglass soon began traveling to many states giving speeches about slavery. He wrote a book about his life as a slave. Douglass had escaped, but he was still a slave. Soon he became well known for his speeches and his book. That put him in danger. Now it was easier for his master to find him. Douglass had to get away, but it meant leaving his family behind. Because many people wanted to hear Douglass speak. He talked about abolishing slavery, which is the act of ending slavery. He sailed to England to get away. He gave speeches there and made many friends. They raised money to buy his freedom. At last, Douglass was free. So just because he's escaped didn't mean that he was free. He actually still had to go back and buy his freedom from his slave master. So 6 cool facts. As a young man in Baltimore, Douglass learned to play the violin. It was a hobby he enjoyed for the rest of his life. Douglass met the President Abraham Lincoln 3 times during the Civil War. After the president died, Mrs. Lincoln gave her husband's favorite walking stick to Douglass. Douglass became active in the Underground Railroad. So remember, that's just like Harriet Tubman. His home in Rochester, New York was a stopping place. Runaway slaves could hide there until it was safe to travel to the next stop. Today, people still visit there. Douglass was known as a great storyteller. He often made family, friends, and audience laugh with his tales. And Douglass wrote 3 books about his life: A Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, My Bondage and My Freedom, and Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. And then in 1899, 4 years after Douglass died, a statue of him was built in Rochester, New York. It was the first time an African American was honored with a statue. It says, A Fight to End Slavery. In 1847, Douglass returned to the United States. He moved his family to Rochester, New York. There he started a newspaper called the North Star. He wrote articles against slavery for the paper. People in the United States did not agree with slavery. That led to the start of the Civil War in 1861. Douglass organized a group of African Americans to fight in the war. So then he became a soldier. New beginnings. The Civil War led to the end of slavery, but Black people were still not treated the same as white people. Douglass gave speeches about treating all people the same. So this is something he said. He said, I would unite with anybody to do right, with nobody to do wrong. In 1882, Anna got sick and died. Douglass was sad and lonely. About 2 years later, he married Helen Pitts. That upset many people because Helen was white. And so down here you have kind of a timeline of Frederick Douglass, just like we saw in the other books. It says he was born in 1818. 1824, he was sent to live on his master's farm. Remember, when he was only 6. 1826, he begins work in a slave house in Baltimore. That's when he went to Baltimore. So when he was 8. And then in 1838, he escapes and marries Anne Murray. And then 1841 gives his first speech against slavery. Douglass never stopped speaking out to others. On February 20th, 1895, he gave a speech to a women's group. He died at home later that day. He was 77 years old. Douglass was a powerful voice for those who believed that all people should be treated equally. Today, his words still inspire others all over the world. And so down here, it's even more of his timeline. 1845, he publishes one of his books. 1846, remember, he goes to England and they buy his freedom. 1847, he started his newspaper, the North Star. 1884, he marries Helen Pitts. In 1895, he died on February 20th. And so this is what we're going to do next. This is called a quiz whiz. So I'm going to ask you guys some questions, and you guys are going to circle them and give me the answer in seesaw. Okay? So these are the questions, and I'm going to put the questions in the recording as the instructions for seesaw too. It says, who took care of Douglass until he was 6 years old? Was it his master's wife, his mother, his aunt, or his grandmother? So who took care of him at the beginning? And then the second question is, The first person to help Douglass learn to read was a white friend, his grandmother, Mrs. Auld, or another slave. So who helped him read? How old was Douglass when he was sent back to the farm after living in Baltimore? 12, 15, 18, or 20? And then Douglass was still a slave when he escaped Baltimore to go to New York. Remember, just because you escape, are you still a slave? And that says true or false. Douglass traveled to what country to keep from being caught and return to his master? Senegal, Canada, England, or Mexico? And Douglass started a newspaper called the Underground Railroad, the North Star, the Slave Papers, or the Life and Time of Frederick Douglass. And which one of these statements about slavery is true? Slaves could travel where they wanted. Was that true? Young slaves were taught to read. Is that true? Slaves who escaped to free states were safe. Remember, he kept on moving. Or slaves had to obey their masters. So what you're going to do is I'm going to have this in Seesaw, and you're just going to circle the right answer. And remember, you can always go back in the video and help you with some of the answers, okay? All right, you guys did an awesome job. Thank you.